All right, today we're diving into a chapter that's really designed to make you stop and question what you think you know about the Soviet Union. We're looking at Chapter 5 of Michael Parenti's Blackshirts and Reds, a piece he calls Stalin's Fingers. And believe me, it's a direct challenge to the history most of us were taught in the West. So let's get right into it. Whenever the conversation turns to the Stalin era, it almost always starts with these absolutely staggering numbers, the sheer scale of the suffering. And as Michael Parenti points out, these numbers are not only huge, they're also all over the place. We're talking anywhere from 5 million all the way up to 25 million. It's a history that's often told through these vast, almost unbelievable figures. And this is the central question Parenti really wants us to ask. He argues that before we accept any of these numbers, we have to take a step back and ask something much more fundamental. Where is this data actually coming from? And that's exactly what we're going to explore, his deep, critical look at the evidence itself. So here's how we're going to break down his argument. First, we'll look at his critique of the numbers. Then we'll get into his questions about the Gulag. From there, we'll dive into his core theory, something he calls siege socialism. After that, we'll see how he tries to balance Soviet crimes and achievements. And finally, we'll wrap it all up with his overall analysis. Okay, so let's start with the numbers. Parenti really kicks off his case by going after the data itself, or, as he sees it, the serious lack of actual data behind some of the most common figures you hear about Soviet-era victims. Just look at the massive range in these estimates. Parenti uses this to make a really critical point. These aren't just small disagreements. He claims that a lot of the influential Western writers who published these numbers almost never showed their methodology. They often just presented what he calls speculation as if it were hard, undeniable fact. In this story, it's a perfect example of his critique in action. The story goes that Winston Churchill saw Stalin hold up his 10 fingers, and he just interpreted that as a quiet confession to killing 10 million people. For Parenti, this is a classic woolly tale, a story with zero actual evidence that somehow over time got treated like a piece of historical fact. So this contrast is absolutely central to Parenti's argument. On one side, you had these massive estimates based on stories and speculation, but on the other side, he points to historians who, in the 1990s, finally got access to the official archives of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. And their conclusion? The documented numbers were way, way lower than what had been claimed for decades. All right, so Parenti then shifts his focus from pure statistics to a really simple, almost logical question about what happened at the end of the Cold War and the fate of that infamous Gulag prison system. He basically challenges the whole idea that the Gulag was this massive, ever-present system right up until the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991. He asks, look, if that was true, when the USSR collapsed, where were the hordes of freed political prisoners? Why weren't their stories plastered all over the news? It's a pretty direct question. And his answer, once again, comes from those Soviet archives. The files show that a massive amnesty happened almost immediately after Stalin died in 1953, releasing more than half of the entire Gulag population. For Parenti, this is solid evidence that the system was being dismantled decades before the Cold War ended, not in its final days. Now, this brings us to what is really the absolute core of Parenti's entire analysis. He argues that to even begin to understand why the Soviet state did the things it did, you have to understand the immense pressure it was under from the outside world, right from day one. And he gives this context a name: siege socialism. This quote right here is Parenti's foundational premise. He's saying the USSR was basically born into a state of permanent crisis, constantly shaped by hostility from the capitalist world. And he argues that this is the crucial context that is almost always left out of mainstream Western history books. So what exactly is siege socialism? Well, it's the idea that what happened in the Soviet Union wasn't some pure test of socialist theory in a lab. Instead, it was a desperate forced march to industrialize and militarize, all driven by the raw need to survive against foreign invasions, economic blockades, and the constant threat of being completely wiped out. And this timeline really puts that idea into perspective. From a civil war backed by foreign powers the moment it was born, to the Nazi invasion that killed over 20 million Soviet citizens, and then straight into the Cold War and the arms race, Parenti's point is that there was never a moment of peace, not one. But, and this is super important, Parenti insists that this context is an explanation, not an excuse for everything that happened. He argues for what he considers a complete picture, one that has to acknowledge both the truly terrible crimes and the very real achievements of the Soviet state. And he absolutely does not pull his punches here. Parenti is very explicit about the crimes he says can't be brushed away by historical necessity. The brutal executions of political rivals, the mass deportations of entire ethnic groups, the bizarre and suffocating personality cult around Stalin, and the systemic crushing of any kind of free thought. But then he insists you have to look at the other side of the ledger. For hundreds of millions of people, he argues, this system brought incredible improvements. Literacy programs that taught whole nations to read, industrial jobs that came with rising wages, universal health care, and a life that he says was just vastly better than the feudalism it replaced. And of course, the big one, the absolutely undeniable role the Soviet Union played in destroying Nazi Germany. So after all that, what does this all add up to? What's the final takeaway from Parenti's analysis in Stalin's fingers? Well, the bottom line is this. He argues that any historical account that focuses only on the Gulag and the repression, while completely ignoring the context of capitalist encirclement and the major material gains for its people, isn't just an incomplete history. He says it's basically propaganda. He is calling for a much more holistic view. And his final, really provocative challenge is aimed right at that common phrase we all hear, that socialism failed. He argues that this view just completely overlooks the fact that for hundreds of millions of people, it was a massive step up from the crushing poverty, the illiteracy, and the exploitation they lived under with feudal lords and colonizers. So, in the end, Parenti's analysis here isn't really about defending or condemning anyone. It's about how we write history itself. He's forcing us to ask, how much does understanding the why, the context of constant, unrelenting threat and pressure, change how we see the what, the often brutal and tragic events that unfolded? And that's a question that really challenges us to think more critically about any historical story we're told.